What's up, everybody? Welcome to The Constitutional Architect. We're going to take things back to when we were in the worst economic crisis in American history. A quarter of the country is out of work. Banks are failing by the hundreds. Bread lines stretch around city blocks. Families are losing farms, homes, savings, everything. Franklin Roosevelt has just won one of the largest electoral landslides in American history. The country has spoken as clearly as it ever has.
Trump spoken.
They want him. They want change. They need someone to act. And he cannot. Not for 4 months. Herbert Hoover is still the president. He's a lame duck, rejected at the polls, stripped of political authority, and legally barred from acting in a meaningful way.
Boo this man!
Without the cooperation of the president-elect, who has no obligation to work with him. Roosevelt, for his part, has no power to do anything at all. He can give speeches, he can make plans, he cannot sign a bill, issue an order, or deploy $1 of federal resources. The banking system is collapsing in real time, and the Constitution, as written, requires the country to sit there and watch for 4 months while the crisis deepens.
This is fine.
Because the founders set Inauguration Day on March 4th, and nobody had gotten around to changing it. This is what the 20th Amendment fixed. It is not a dramatic amendment. It does not protect a fundamental right or resolve a moral question. It fixes a flaw in the machinery, a flaw that had been tolerable in 1788 and had become dangerous by 1933.
Flaw? The slightest flaw, Your Excellency.
That's what this episode's about. As always, let me introduce myself. I'm JP, a former Special Forces officer with 14 years of service, having deployed to 11 countries across 3 continents. In that world, you learn something about the cost of delay. When a system has a structural flaw, the question isn't whether it will cause a problem. It's when and how bad. The founders built an outstanding system. They also built it for a country of 4 million people communicating by horseback. Some things needed updating. The purpose of this channel is to give you the tools to think through these provisions for yourself. Let's get into it.
You ready? Ready, Captain.
Alright, so the original Constitution set Inauguration Day on March 4th. That wasn't arbitrary. It was practical. In 1788, winning a presidential election and actually becoming president required time. Electors had to travel to their state capitals to cast their vote. Results had to be physically transported to Congress in New York, later Philadelphia, and then Washington. The president-elect himself had to travel, often over rough roads and in difficult weather. George Washington's journey, for example, from Mount Vernon to New York for his first inauguration took 8 days. 4 months wasn't excess. It was the minimum time needed to make the transition work. The same logic applied to Congress. The new Congress elected in November didn't convene until the following December, 13 months after the election. The outgoing Congress, meanwhile, convened for a final session starting in December and running through March. This was the lame duck session, a Congress full of members who had already been defeated or retired, voting on legislation that would govern a country they would no longer represent.
This seems wildly irresponsible. Yeah.
For the first several decades of the Republic, this was manageable. Communication was slow, governance was slow, the gap between election and inauguration was annoying but not catastrophic. Then the country changed. Railroads crossed the continent, the telegraph connected cities in seconds, the telephone arrived, the radio arrived. By the early 20th century, a president-elect could travel from anywhere in the country to Washington in days, not months. Election results were known on election night. The 4-month gap that had gone from a practical necessity to a structural liability, and the lame duck Congress had become something worse than inefficient.
Duck season, fire!
Alright, let's talk about this lame duck problem. A lame duck Congress is a Congress full of people who have already lost their elections, or who have chosen not to run again, and who are therefore accountable to no one for their vote. That sounds abstract. The historical record makes it concrete. Defeated members of Congress in their final months voted on legislation they would never have supported while facing re-election. They cut deals. They accepted bribes with less risk. Because what was anybody going to do? Vote them out?
There's nothing you have that I could possibly want.
They blocked legislation that the newly elected majority had been sent to Washington specifically to pass. And because the new Congress couldn't convene until December of the following year. The newly elected members sat at home for 13 months before they could do anything about it. Senator George Norris of Nebraska spent years documenting the problem and building the case for a fix. His argument was simple. In a democracy, the people's will should be reflected in their government as quickly as possible. A 4-month gap between election and inauguration, and a 13-month gap before a new Congress could meet, meant that the government the people had just voted for didn't actually govern for a better part of a year. The people who had just been fired were still running the country.
Let's burn the place down.
Norris introduced what would become the 20th Amendment repeatedly, starting in 1923. It took a decade of effort and the catastrophe of the Great Depression to finally get it through. Alright, the Hoover-Roosevelt interregnum. The winter of 1932 to 33 is the clearest illustration of why the amendment was necessary. And it arrived just in time to be the last time the problem played out. Roosevelt won the November 1932 election in a landslide. Hoover was finished, but March 4th was still 11 weeks away. And the banking system was not going to wait 11 weeks. Between Election Day and Inauguration Day, roughly 4,000 banks failed or suspended operations. By the time Roosevelt took office, 32 states had declared bank holidays, closing their banks entirely to prevent runs. The Federal Reserve was nearly paralyzed. The financial architecture of the country was dissolving in real time. Hoover reached out to Roosevelt repeatedly, asking him to jointly commit to certain policies that might stabilize the markets. Roosevelt declined. He was under no obligation to pre-commit to Hoover's approach, and doing so would have constrained his own presidency before it started. Hoover, for his part, couldn't act decisively without Roosevelt's buy-in because any action he took might be immediately reversed by the incoming administration. Two men, both constitutionally positioned, neither able to govern effectively. The country paid for it.
We are suffering, as all Americans are.
On March 4th, 1933, Roosevelt was inaugurated. On March 9th, 5 days later, he called Congress into emergency session and began passing the New Deal legislation that would reshape the country. 5 days, the machinery that had been paralyzed for 4 months began moving the moment the constitutional calendar allowed it. The 20th Amendment was ratified on January 23, 1933, 6 weeks before Roosevelt was even inaugurated. It was the last time a president would wait until March 4th to take office. Every president since has been inaugurated on January 20th. Alright, what the amendment actually does. The 20th Amendment is 3 provisions, and the third one almost nobody talks about. Section 1 moves Inauguration Day from March 4th to January 20th. Cutting the transition period from roughly 4 months to roughly 11 weeks. Presidential terms now end and begin on January 20th at noon. Section 2 moves the start date of Congress from the following December to January 3rd. This eliminates the 13-month gap between election and the new Congress taking its seat, and effectively kills the lame duck session as a governing institution. A new Congress now convenes within 2 months of being elected. Section 3, here's the one people miss. What happens if a president-elect dies between Election Day and January 20th? Before the 20th Amendment, this question had no clean constitutional answer. After it, the answer is, the vice president-elect becomes president. But the amendment goes further. It gives Congress the authority to legislate for the scenario where neither the president-elect nor the vice president-elect has qualified by Inauguration Day. Congress can designate who acts as president until a qualified president or vice president is determined. This was 1933 thinking ahead. The founders had provisions for a president dying in office. They didn't have clean provisions for a president-elect dying in the 11 weeks between election and inauguration. The 20th fixed that.
Get them all patched up?
Sure did, Daddy.
January 20th in the modern era. The January 20th date has taken on its own constitutional weight since ratification. The most significant stress test came on January 6, 2021, when the joint session of Congress meeting to certify the Electoral College results was interrupted by the storming of the Capitol. The constitutional machinery established by the 20th Amendment and subsequent legislation building on it was tested in a way the drafters of the amendment hadn't specifically anticipated. The certification happened the same night. The inauguration proceeded on January 20th. The transition period itself, now 11 weeks rather than 4 months, has become the subject of its own debates about whether it's the right length. Some argue 11 weeks is too short for an incoming administration to build a government, hire thousands of political appointees, and prepare to govern.
It's just there's so much to do.
Others argue it's still too long, that in a world of instant communication and modern transportation, 2 weeks would be sufficient. The core question the 20th Amendment answered, how long should the gap be between election and inauguration, has not been definitively resolved. It was answered differently in 1933 than it was in 1788. A future generation may answer it differently still. The larger question. The 20th Amendment is not a story about rights. It's not a story about justice. It's a story about a country that built a system for one era and had to update it to another. The founders knew this would happen. They built Article 5 specifically because they understood that no document written in 1787 could anticipate every challenge a growing nation would face. They made the amendment process hard, deliberately, because they didn't want the Constitution rewritten every time the political winds shifted. But they made it possible because they knew the alternative was a document that would eventually become a relic. The 20th Amendment is a reminder that constitutional maintenance is not a failure on the original design. It is the original design working as intended. And here's the question we're sitting with as we close. The people who ratified the 20th Amendment in 1933 were living through a world that was changing faster than the institutions around them could keep up. Railroads and telegraphs had made March 4th obsolete. The Great Depression had made the 4-month transition dangerous. They looked at what they had inherited, identified what no longer worked, and fixed it. We're living through our own version of that moment. The pace of change around us, technological, economic, geopolitical, is accelerating in ways that stress test institutional design that was built for a different world. The question is not whether the Constitution will need further updating. It will.
It is inevitable.
The question is whether we'll recognize the problem clearly enough and build the political consensus required to fix them before the cost becomes catastrophic. What do you think needs fixing? Drop a comment and let's talk about it.
Let's talk.
And that's the 20th Amendment. It was ratified on January 23rd, 1933. It moved Inauguration Day from March 4th to January 20th. moved the congressional start date to January 3rd, and established succession rules for a president-elect who dies before taking office. It solved a problem that had been building for 140 years and became urgent in the worst economic crisis in American history. It's not the sexiest amendment, but it's a necessary one. And it is proof that constitutional maintenance, the unglamorous work of fixing what time reveals to be broken, is itself a form of constitutional fidelity. Next episode, the 21st Amendment. Wait, we already did that one with the 18th. Next episode, the 22nd Amendment. Presidential term limits. After FDR served 4 terms, Congress in the states decided no president should ever do that again. 2 terms, that's it. The amendment passed in 1947, was ratified in 1951, and has shaped every presidency since. That's next.
This is incredibly relevant.
If this episode gave you something to think about, like, share, follow, and please go subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you then.
Oh,